when I opened my front door that morning and saw 5 neighbors standing on the sidewalk staring at my house, some of them holding their phones up like they were filming. I knew something terrible had happened. I just didn't know yet that the 23-year-old man who'd slept in my guest room the night before had somehow become the center of a scandal I hadn't seen coming. If you're listening, stay with me, because everything you think you know about women like me, about wealth and loneliness and what happens when someone half your age crosses your threshold, is about to fall apart in ways I still can't fully explain. My name is Victoria. I'm 61 years old, and I've been living alone in this house in Greenwich, Connecticut for the past 8 years, ever since my husband died and my 2 daughters moved to opposite coasts, and my entire life narrowed down to charity galas I attend. Out of obligation and silent dinners with myself in a dining room that seats 12, I made my money in tech, sold my company for more than I'll ever need, and everyone assumes that means I'm happy, that wealth equals contentment. But the truth is, I wake up every single day in a house so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat. And I wonder if this is all there is, if this is what winning looks like. The neighbors in this area don't really talk to me. They smile politely when we pass on the street. They wave from their cars, but there's always been this distance, this sense that I don't quite fit, maybe. Because I made my own money instead of marrying into it. Maybe because I'm alone and that makes people uncomfortable. Maybe because I've never been good at the social games wealthy women are supposed to play. I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've been inside someone else's home, been invited to anything beyond the obligatory holiday party where everyone drinks expensive wine and talks about their children's achievements, and I stand in the corner, feeling like an exhibit, the successful widow, the woman who has everything except what matters. The young man showed up at my door 2 nights before the scandal. It was raining, that cold October rain that soaks through everything. And I was in my study working on correspondence when the doorbell rang, which was unusual because nobody just drops by unannounced in this neighborhood. Everything is planned, scheduled, coordinated. I answered the door, and there he was, soaking wet, shivering, early 20s maybe, dark hair, plastered to his forehead, wearing jeans and a thin jacket that clearly wasn't enough for the weather, and he said, "I'm so sorry to bother you. My car broke down about a mile from here. My phone died. I just need to use a phone to call for help. I promise I'll be gone in 5 minutes." I should have been scared, should have felt that instinctive fear of a strange man at your door after dark. But something in his face stopped me, something in the way he was trying so hard not to seem threatening, keeping his distance, his hands visible, apologizing before I'd even said anything. I let him in, told him to wait in the foyer while I got my phone, and when I came back he was standing exactly where I'd left him, dripping on my marble floor, looking around at the chandelier and the artwork and the grand staircase, with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between awe and discomfort. He tried to call someone, but nobody answered, tried another number, same thing, and I could see panic starting to creep into his face, that particular panic of being stranded and alone and out of options. I heard myself say, "You can't walk back out in that rain. Why don't you stay here tonight? I have plenty of room. You can call again in the morning." And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt this rush of something, fear maybe, or recklessness, or just the desperate loneliness of a woman who hadn't had another human being in her house in months. He looked at me like I'd offered him something impossible. Said, "Are you sure I done?" It want to impose, and I said I'm sure, and I led him upstairs to one of the guest rooms, gave him towels, told him there were clothes in the closet from when my son-in-law stayed over years ago, told him to help himself to anything in the kitchen. He thanked me about 17 times, and I left him there, and went back downstairs and sat in my study trying to understand what I'd just done, why I'd invited a complete stranger to spend the night in my home. His name was Daniel. I learned that over the awkward dinner we shared, because I'd already made food, and it seemed cruel to eat alone. While he was upstairs hungry, and we sat at my long dining table, him at one end and me at the other because sitting close felt too intimate, and he told me he was driving from Boston to New York for a job interview. He'd just graduated college, had been working odd jobs, trying to save money, This interview was for a position at an architecture firm, and it was his first real shot at starting a career. He asked what I did, and I gave him the simplified version. Said I used to run a tech company, I'm retired now, and he said, "Wow, that is incredible." And there was something genuine in the way he said it, like he actually meant it, like he wasn't just being polite. We talked for almost 2 hours, longer than I'd talked to anyone in months, and I found myself telling him things I didn't tell people, about how lonely success can be, about how I built something from nothing and then sold it and suddenly had all this money and no purpose, about how my daughters are busy with their own lives and I'm proud of them, but sometimes I feel like I've become invisible, like I served my function as a mother, and now I'm just this figure they check on out of duty. Daniel listened in a way people don't usually listen, really listened, didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything, just absorbed what I was saying and then said, "I think a lot of people feel invisible. I think that's one of the hardest parts of being human, wanting to be seen and not knowing how to make that happen." He told me about growing up with a single mom who worked 3 jobs, about putting himself through college with loans and scholarships, about how he'd been sleeping in his car sometimes when he couldn't afford rent, about how this job interview felt like his one chance to prove he could make something of himself. I asked why he hadn't mentioned the car sleeping thing earlier, why he'd acted like staying over was such an imposition, and he said because people judge, especially in neighborhoods like this. If you tell someone you've been homeless even temporarily, they look at you differently, they assume things about your character, your choices, your worth. That first night passed without incident. I showed him to his room, said goodnight, went to my own room down the hall, and lay awake for hours thinking about the strange intimacy of having another person in the house, hearing someone else moving around, using the bathroom, existing in the space I'd claimed as entirely mine. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee, came downstairs to find Daniel in the kitchen. He'd made breakfast, eggs and toast. Nothing fancy, but the gesture was so unexpected I almost cried, and he said, "I wanted to say thank you. I hope this is okay. I used eggs from your fridge," and I said, "It's more than okay." And we ate together and talked about nothing important and everything important at the same time. He called a tow truck after breakfast. They said they could come get his car by afternoon, and I found myself saying, "Why don't you stay until after your interview tomorrow? Get some rest, make sure you're prepared." And he looked at me with this mix of gratitude and confusion and said, "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me?" And I didn't have a good answer, except to say, "Maybe I need the company as much as you need the help." He stayed that second night. We had dinner again, talked until late, and at some point during that conversation, I realized I was happier than I'd been in years, that this random stranger had walked into my house and somehow made me feel less alone, less invisible, less like a woman whose life was already over. The scandal started the next morning, the morning of his interview. Daniel came downstairs wearing one of the suits I'd kept from my husband. I'd offered it the night before, said it would be better than the wrinkled shirt he'd been traveling in, and it fit him almost perfectly. He looked nervous, kept adjusting his tie, and I fixed it for him, stood there in my foyer fixing a 23-year-old man's tie. Like I was his mother, except it didn't feel maternal. It felt like something else, something I didn't want to examine too closely. I walked him out to the porch, wished him luck, and he hugged me, just a quick grateful hug, and then he got into the Uber I'd called for him because his car still wasn't fixed. What I didn't know was that Margaret from 3 houses down was walking her dog, had been watching my house with increasing interest for the past 2 days because she'd noticed a strange car parked on the street, had probably seen Daniel coming and going, and when she saw him leave that morning in a suit, saw me hug him on the porch, she apparently decided she'd witnessed something scandalous. By noon, I had a text from Patricia, one of the few women in the neighborhood, who occasionally speaks to me, saying, "Victoria, people are talking. Is everything all right?" And I had no idea what she meant, texted back, asking what people were saying, and she called instead of texting back. Patricia said, "Margaret has been telling everyone you have a young man staying at your house. She saw him leaving this morning in what looked like expensive clothes. She's implying that you're," and she paused, "that you're involved with him romantically, and people are talking. Victoria, You know how this neighborhood is. I felt my face go hot, felt this wave of humiliation and anger and disbelief, said Patricia. That's absurd. He's a young man whose car broke down. I let him stay while he waited for it. To get fixed, there's nothing inappropriate happening. And Patricia said, I believe you, but you know Margaret, she's already told half the neighborhood, and now everyone's speculating. I hung up and sat there trying to process what was happening, how a simple act of kindness had been twisted into something sordid. How people had looked at me, a 61-year-old woman and a 23-year-old man, and immediately assumed the worst. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Angry at Margaret for spreading rumors. Angry at the neighbors for believing them. Angry at a society that can't imagine a woman my age doing anything that isn't somehow shameful or desperate or pathetic. I wanted to march over to Margaret's house and confront her, wanted to call everyone who'd heard the rumor and explain, but I knew that would only make it worse. Would only confirm that there was something to explain. Daniel came back that afternoon glowing. The interview had gone well, they'd offered him the job on the spot. He'd start in 2 weeks, and I was so happy for him I forgot about the scandal for a moment, forgot about Margaret and the rumors and the judgment, just focused on this young man who'd gotten his break, who'd proven he could make it. He noticed something was off, asked if I was okay, and I made the mistake of telling him what Patricia had said about Margaret's rumors, about the neighborhood gossip, and I watched his face fall. Watched him realize that his presence in my home had caused me problems. He said, I'm so sorry, I never meant to cause trouble for you, I should leave right now, and I said no, you're not leaving, you didn't do anything wrong, I didn't do anything wrong, we have nothing to be ashamed of, but even as I said it, I felt shame, felt that deep, humiliating shame of being judged, of having people think they know what you are, what you want, what you're capable of. Daniel said, but people are talking about you, about us, doesn't that bother you? And I said, of course it bothers me. I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I've never given anyone reason to gossip. I've been quiet and appropriate and invisible, and the one time I do something kind, something human, it gets turned into a scandal. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Margaret's face the few times I'd spoken to her at neighborhood events, the way she'd looked at me with barely concealed disdain, the way she'd once asked if I ever got lonely in that big house all by myself. And I'd said, no, I'm fine, because admitting loneliness felt like admitting failure. I thought about all the times I'd walked past groups of neighbors talking and they'd gone quiet, wondered how many times I'd been the subject of their speculation, how many times my solitude had been interpreted as arrogance or weirdness or something to pity. I thought about my daughters, who I hadn't told about Daniel because it seemed like such a small thing, letting someone stay over. But now I wondered if I should call them, warn them in case the rumors spread somehow, and I hated that. I was even thinking that way, hated that I felt I needed to defend myself. The next morning I woke up to find Daniel packing his things. His car had been fixed, delivered overnight, and he was getting ready to leave, and I felt this irrational panic, this sense that once he left, I'd go back to being invisible, go back to the silence and the loneliness and the endless empty days. I made us breakfast. We ate mostly in silence, and when he finished, he said, Victoria, I don't know how to thank you. You gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere to go. You treated me like a person when most people wouldn't have even opened the door. You changed my life, and I said you don't need to thank me. You gave me something too. You reminded me what it feels like to connect with someone, to be seen. He left right after breakfast, hugged me goodbye on the porch again, probably giving Margaret more ammunition if she was watching, and I stood there watching his car disappear down the street and felt that familiar loneliness settling back over me like a weight. I went inside and the house felt emptier than it ever had, every room echoing with absence, and I realized how much his presence had filled the space, not physically but emotionally, how having someone to talk to, someone to cook for, someone to worry about, had given me purpose I didn't know I was missing. The scandal got worse before it got better, or maybe it didn't get better. Maybe I just stopped caring as much. Over the next few days, I noticed neighbors staring more obviously, conversations stopping when I walked by, and one afternoon Sandra from next door actually knocked on my door, which had never happened before, and when I answered, she said, "Victoria, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is it true you had a young man staying with you?" And I said, "Yes, his car broke down. I offered him a place to stay. Is that a problem?" And she said, "No, of course not. I just wanted to make sure you were safe. You know how dangerous it can be letting strangers into your home." The implication was clear. She thought I'd been reckless, thought I'd put myself in danger, thought I needed protection from my own poor judgment, and I said, "Sandra, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of assessing risk. I've been taking care of myself for a very long time." And she nodded, but her face said she didn't believe me, said she thought I was a foolish old woman who'd gotten lucky that nothing bad happened. After she left, I stood in my foyer shaking with anger and humiliation, angry that I had to justify my choices to people who'd never shown the slightest interest in my well-being, humiliated that my kindness had been interpreted as stupidity or desperation or something to worry about. A week after Daniel left, I got a package, no return address, and when I opened it, I found a letter and a framed photo. The letter was from Daniel. He'd written pages about how grateful he was, how the job was going well, how he'd found an apartment, how he thought about our conversations constantly, how I'd restored his faith in human kindness when he'd been on the verge of giving up. The photo was of us from that morning. I'd fixed his tie. I hadn't even known. He'd taken it, must have been a selfie, and in it I'm smiling, really smiling. Not the polite smile I use at charity events, but something genuine, and I'm looking at him with this expression of tenderness I barely recognize as my own. I put the photo on my desk in the study, and every time I look at it, I remember what it felt like to matter to someone, to be more than just the wealthy widow in the big house, the quiet character in all of this, the person who changed everything without saying much at all, was Robert, my neighbor 4 houses down, a man in his 70s who'd lost his wife around the same time I lost my husband and who I'd exchanged maybe 15 words with in 8 years. About 2 weeks after the scandal started, I was getting my mail and Robert was getting his, and we nodded politely like always, but instead of walking away, he came over to my mailbox and said, "Victoria, I want you to know I think what you did was kind, giving that young man a place to stay. People around here could use more kindness." And then he walked away before I could respond. That brief interaction shifted something in me, made me realize that not everyone was judging me, that some people saw past the scandal to the simple human act underneath, and it gave me strength I didn't know I needed. A few days later, I ran into Patricia again, and she said, "Margaret's still talking. She's saying you must be going through some kind of crisis. Having a young man stay with you like that? She's actually concerned about your mental state." And I said, "Patricia, tell Margaret and anyone else who's concerned that I'm perfectly fine. I don't regret helping Daniel. I'd do it again. And if people want to make that into something ugly that says more about them than it does about me." Patricia looked surprised, said, "Good for you, Victoria, you're right." And then she said, I always thought you seemed lonely. I always meant to invite you over, but I never did. I think a lot of us are guilty of making assumptions about people we don't really know." And I said, "It's never too late to get to know someone." And she invited me over for coffee the next day. We talked for hours, really talked, and I learned that Patricia had her own struggles, her own loneliness, despite being surrounded by country club friends and social obligations. And she said, "I think a lot of women our age feel invisible, feel like we're supposed to just fade into the background and be grateful for what we have." And I said, "I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of pretending I'm fine when I'm not." Daniel started calling me once a week, just to check in, tell me about his job, ask how I was doing, and those calls became something I looked forward to, proof that our connection hadn't been temporary, hadn't been just about him needing help. He told me about the friends he was making, the projects he was working on, the woman he'd started dating, and I was genuinely happy for him, not jealous or possessive, or any of the things Margaret probably assumed I did be, just happy that someone I cared about was building a good life. One night he said, "Victoria, you saved my life that night. You let me stay. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean literally. I'd been sleeping in my car for 2 weeks. I was running out of money and hope. I was starting to think I'd made a mistake trying to pursue this career. And then you opened your door, and gave me a place to rest and food to eat and someone to talk to, and it changed everything. I told him he'd saved me too, in a different way, said he'd reminded me that I still had something to offer. That kindness matters. That connection is possible even when you think you've used up all your chances. He said, I wish I could make people understand that. Make your neighbors understand that nothing inappropriate happened. That you were just being a good person. And I said, I don't need them to understand. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's enough. But it wasn't enough. Not entirely, because the rumors had done their damage, had reinforced my outsider status in the neighborhood, had given people confirmation of whatever they'd already decided about me. I noticed fewer invitations to neighborhood events, more obvious avoidance, and part of me wanted to move, wanted to go somewhere. No one knew me or cared about my choices, but another part of me refused to run, refused to let judgment drive me from my home. I'd been invisible for so long. And yeah, the visibility that came from scandal wasn't what I'd wanted, but at least people were seeing me now, even if they were seeing me wrong. About 3 months after Daniel left, I was at a charity gala, one of those events, where wealthy people dress up and write checks and feel virtuous, and I was standing alone as usual when a woman approached me, someone I didn't know, mid-50s, elegant, and she said, You're Victoria, right? I heard about what happened with the young man, and my whole body tensed, prepared for judgment. But, she said, I think that was brave. My daughter is about his age, and if she were stranded, I'd hope someone like you would help her. I hope someone would see her as a human being who needed kindness and not just as an opportunity to gossip. We talked for over an hour. Her name was Catherine. She'd recently moved to the area, and she said she'd heard the rumors from several people, everyone framing it as some kind of scandal. But she said when she actually listened to what happened, stripped away the innuendo and judgment, it was just a story about someone helping someone else, and she couldn't understand why that was scandalous. I said because I'm a 61-year-old woman, and he was a 23-year-old man. People can't imagine that interaction being innocent, can't imagine that I might have needs that aren't sexual, might just want company, conversation, connection. And she said that's their failure of imagination, not yours. Catherine and I became friends after that night. Real friends. She invited me to dinners, introduced me to other women who weren't part of the established neighborhood clique, and slowly I built something I'd never had before, an actual social life, actual friendships, based on who I really was instead of what I represented. Patricia joined our group eventually, and a few other women, and we called ourselves the Misfits as a joke, all of us women who didn't quite fit the mold, who had complicated lives or unconventional choices, or just refused to pretend everything was perfect all the time. Daniel came to visit about 6 months after he'd first stayed with me, drove up from New York for the day, and I was nervous about it, worried that seeing him again would be awkward, would prove that the connection I remembered had been exaggerated or temporary. But the moment he walked into my house, it felt like coming home, felt easy and natural, and we spent the whole day talking, catching up, and he met Patricia and Catherine when they stopped by, and I could see them understanding what I'd tried to explain, seeing that Daniel and I had something real, something that transcended age or expectations or whatever Margaret had decided we were. That evening, Daniel said, Victoria, I want you to know something. That night I knocked on your door, I was at the lowest point of my life. I'd been rejected from so many jobs, been sleeping in my car, been wondering if I should just give up and go back to Boston and work at my uncle's construction company and forget about architecture. And then you answered the door and you looked at me like I was a person. Not a problem, not a burden, just a person, and that changed me. He said, I think about that night all the time, about how different my life could have turned out if you'd turned me away, if you'd been afraid, or suspicious, or just unwilling to help, and I'm successful now, I'm happy now, and it's because you gave me a chance when I needed it most. I told him I thought about that night constantly too, said it had exposed things I'd been avoiding, my loneliness, my fear of judgment, my desperate hunger for connection, and while the scandal had been painful, it had also forced me to examine my life, to stop pretending I was fine with being invisible, to start building relationships, and taking risks and living like I still had years ahead of me instead of just waiting quietly to die. I said you showed me that I still matter, that I still have something to offer, and I can't thank you enough for that. Margaret saw Daniel's car in my driveway that day, I found out later. And apparently she made some comment to someone about how I was. Still involved with that young man, still making a spectacle of myself, and when Patricia heard about it she actually confronted. Margaret told her to stop spreading lies about me, told her that she'd met Daniel and seen our friendship firsthand and there was nothing inappropriate about it, told her that maybe if she spent less time judging other people, she'd be less miserable herself. Patricia told me about this conversation later, said Margaret had been shocked and defensive, and ultimately walked away in a huff, and I asked why she'd done that, why she'd stood up for me, and Patricia said, because you deserve better, because I've spent too many years being complicit in this neighborhood's cruelty by staying silent, and I'm done with that. The scandal never fully died. I think some people will always believe whatever. Margaret told them, will always see me as that desperate older woman who let a young man take advantage of her kindness. But I stopped caring what those people think, stopped letting their judgment dictate my choices. I started volunteering at a homeless shelter, inspired by Daniel's story, and I met dozens of young people, trying to get back on their feet, trying to build lives from nothing, and I helped where I could, offered advice, wrote recommendation letters, made connections, and every time I helped someone I thought about that rainy October night when a stranger knocked on my door and I said yes instead of no. Daniel and I still talk regularly. He's thriving at his job, got promoted recently, and he's getting serious with the woman he's been dating, brought her to visit me last month, and she's lovely, smart, and kind, and exactly the kind of person I'd want for him. They're talking about getting engaged, and Daniel asked if I'd come to the wedding when it happens, said I'm family now, said I played such an important role in his life that he can't imagine celebrating without me there, and I cried when he said that, actual tears, because I'd spent so many years feeling like my role in everyone's life was finished, like I'd served my purpose and now I was just taking up space, and here was this young man telling me I mattered, I belonged, I was family. The truth is, my whole world did flip that night. Daniel knocked on my door, not in the way the neighbors assumed, not in some scandalous romantic way, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. I went from being a woman who'd accepted loneliness as her fate to being a woman who understood that connection is always possible, that kindness creates ripples, that taking risks is worth the judgment that comes with it. I went from invisible to visible, from isolated to connected, from someone who'd given up on mattering to someone who understood that we all matter, that every interaction has the potential to change a life, that sometimes the person you're saving is also the person saving you. I look at that photo on my desk sometimes, the one Daniel took that morning before his interview, and I see a version of myself I didn't know existed. A woman who's smiling not because she's supposed to, but because she's genuinely happy. And I think about how close I came to never answering that door, how close I came to staying safe and isolated and slowly dying of loneliness in my big empty house. The scandal was painful, the judgment was humiliating, but I'd go through it all again, endure every whisper and rumor and shocked stare, because what I gained was worth infinitely more than what I lost. Margaret still doesn't speak to me, crosses the street when she sees me coming, and honestly, I'm fine with that. I don't need people in my life who are determined to misunderstand me, who see kindness as weakness or connection as scandal. I have Patricia and Catherine and the misfits. I have Daniel and his girlfriend and the extended family I'm building. Through friendship instead of blood, I have purpose again, have reasons to wake up every morning beyond just getting through another day, and I owe so much of that to a 23-year-old man whose car broke down at exactly the right moment, who knocked on exactly the right door, who needed help in exactly the way I needed to give it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd said no that night, if I'd told Daniel I couldn't help him, if I'd stayed safe and appropriate and invisible, and every time I think about it, I feel this wave of gratitude that I didn't, that I took the risk, that I opened my door and my home and ultimately my heart to the possibility of connection. The neighbors can think whatever they want, can create whatever stories make sense to them, can judge me until they run out of breath. But I know what really happened in my house during those 2 days. I know the truth of the connection, Daniel. And I formed, and I know that truth matters more than any scandal ever could. I'm 61 years old. I'm wealthy. I'm alone in many ways, but I'm not invisible anymore. I'm not waiting to die. I'm living, really living, for the first time in years. And if that makes me a scandal, then I'll wear that label proudly, because at least it means I'm still here, still capable of surprising people, still refusing to fade quietly into the background like wealthy widows are supposed to do. Daniel gave me that gift, the gift of being seen, of mattering, of understanding that my story isn't over. It's just entering a new chapter. One where I get to decide what happens next instead of letting loneliness and fear and judgment make those decisions for me. When Daniel calls now, I don't just tell him about my week. I tell him about the risks I'm taking, the connections I'm making, the life I'm building, and he tells me he's proud of me, says I inspire him. And I think about how strange and beautiful it is that this young man I knew for only 2 days changed my entire trajectory. Prove that kindness matters, that human connection can happen anywhere, between anyone, if we're brave enough to say yes instead of no, if we're willing to risk judgment for the possibility of being truly seen. And maybe that's what the neighbors saw when they filmed my porch, when they whispered and judged and created their scandal. Maybe what they really saw was a woman choosing life over safety, connection over isolation, visibility over invisibility. Maybe what started their scandal was simply the revolutionary act of a 61-year-old woman refusing to disappear. And if that scandalous, then I hope I never stop being a scandal, because the alternative, the slow, quiet death of living alone and unseen and disconnected, is so much worse than anything Margaret or anyone else could say about me.